Now, what I'd say about this submission, I think you must see it in the context of the relationship at the Overseas Territories Consultative Committee that occurred late last year when you had all the overseas territories represented. What you've seen by the coalition government is very much what you hear from President Obama. He talks about the era of engagement, and it's an interesting, I suppose, turning on its heels of what has been the relationship even under a Labour government. Here you have a coalition government which seems to have a very high level of interest in trying to actually talk to the overseas territories in a way that conveys and suggests a real interest in trying to change the model short of self-determination. And I think that what is interesting has been at the meetings that there was a real interest in trying to show that you can have a relationship that doesn't have to be them and us. So this is part of that continuing conversation. And as they are looking to formalize, probably by the second quarter, possibly sooner, a white paper, they have been going out to the overseas territories and asking for submissions. And that's the idea, is so that it can be woven into what happens next. Now, even when you were at the overseas territories, there was a couple of lunches where nobody but the leaders and the politicians on the UK side were present, and particularly the lunch meeting with the International Strategic Defense. They were looking, and Bermuda is always seen somewhat differently because we have a more advanced constitution, and obviously the issues that we have differ. But it was interesting, even there you heard a gamut of issues from people who were talking about the poaching as well as illegal unlawful aliens, and also from a Bermuda point of view, what we're always interested in particular is what type of functional cooperation and technical assistance is there available. For instance, as the UK looks at different issues, and even as certain things may have passed their sell-by date for them, is there anything, as we look at issues, whether it's like Coast Guards or others, are there areas where there may be items that are surplus to their requirements, but that may have some relevance and currency for us? In particular, what we often talk about is the European Union. We often talk about the European Union in terms of engagement, and whether, as a dependent territory, is the UK in a position that it really is speaking up vociferously in favor of Bermuda. Now, we have representative in Brussels, but Brussels is becoming probably more a sphere of action. And in terms of the decisions that it's making that can impact on Bermuda and other overseas territories, it's important that we're represented. The whole issue, even in terms of Solvency II, the driver sometimes of some of the changes in terms of, particularly for our business sector, is coming from Europe. And you've heard probably more recently, the focus hasn't been so much on talking about NEO, but it's in terms of, you hear about Solvency II. And so what you want to make sure is, because we are a small territory, you want to make sure that those who are there to represent us, even in terms of the UK, how aggressively and how publicly are they speaking up in favor of Bermuda, particularly when you look at it in the context of what happened a few years ago with the white paper, with the white list, where we would take the position and did a search, particularly from the Ministry of Finance, that Bermuda was thrown under the bus, notwithstanding all the progress. So what you see is that is a sort of context of some of the discussion, and also the context in terms of the UK hearing Bermuda, hearing others, and wanting to get a sense of showing that they are with us. Now, how does this, in some ways, what does this mean to Bermuda? What does it mean to the people of Bermuda? Well, you may not be aware that probably, was it last week, there was an open mic session. And it's interesting because one of the questions raised by some of the young people, two young people, young women in fact, was how can they be participating in terms of, like they say in the US, they're in college and they see young people are being promoted and able to represent their country and get more engaged, not in terms of partisan politics, but in terms of sort of diplomatic, in terms of Congress and being interns and all the rest of it. As a result of that, I did a follow-up with our representative in Brussels, because when I was in Brussels last year, the European Union, they had indicated that there was some interest, if we had an interest and Bermudians had an interest, in seeing whether there is the opportunity for stages as they call them, which is sort of like an internship for a period, and working in terms of areas so that people get to know Bermuda and also are participating in terms of the issues that affect Bermuda. We talk here, as you'll see, amongst a number of other things, is that even in terms of this sort of diplomacy, embassies, where is the space, and can a space be created whereby, as part of, because we don't want money per se, that's not the issue. What we want is opportunities. You'll see a lot of the thrust is about secondments, it's about exchanges, it's about providing opportunities, not just for in the public sector, but even in the private sector. And I don't know if there's an area that piqued your interest, but one that I look at even as we're seeking to navigate through this economic tailspin, is that what opportunities are there even in terms of funding for developers? Not funding for the Bermuda government, but you have banks here, yes, but Bermuda doesn't have a whole host of banks. But what are the opportunities as you look at it? I think the CS might remind me, is it called as the, I can't recall, but it's maybe Commonwealth Development Association or Corporation. And they too are going through a sort of rebranding, so they don't have any maybe as fixed sort of parameters for lending as they used to. But it's looking at it from the point of view, because government can't pink up when hotels or hotel developers or other developers want money. It's not that the government is going to always be the one who can help, but we can sometimes use, through strategic alliances and strategic partnerships, recommend. And I also wanted to know what were the opportunities there, and what is interesting, and I suppose what's positive and engaging, at the very least, very political, I think, is the fact that there's always the language is such that it seems as if anything can be considered. Sometimes what you used to get was no, but now it's a sort of different approach where it's, well, let's see if we can. Let's see if we can. And even in terms of issues like when we talk about airlines, you know that we have entrustments for tiers. Even though we're in overseas territory, we do have that special carve-outs on issues to do with tax information exchange agreements, where I don't have to go cap in hand and ask for permission on those issues. But we're saying that let's see as if we can widen that sphere. Even in terms of airline and airlift, certain things it's allowed, but when you talk about actually going across, where it actually talks about coming from Europe into Bermuda, what are the opportunities there? And I think that what is interesting is the fact, notwithstanding sometimes the headlines, is the fact that you don't want what works to be based on personalities. It's as if one has a relationship with a media entity, it shouldn't be based on whether they like person X or Premier Y or that media entity. It's institutionalizing the relationship so that whoever is in the position, that happens. But same in terms of when you're dealing with an overseas territory and an overseas territory leader and a governor or whatever. It shouldn't matter the fact that if you have a decent relationship, that it works. works. You want that for sustainability, even when it goes further, people change, premiers change, governors change, you want to know that there is a rule of engagement. So that's why you'll see, even in the reference to the issues of security, when we say that there is a Governor's Council. Governor's Council sits like in the cabinet room, and it meets relatively infrequently, but it's really represented by the key person, which is the considered the governor, the deputy governor, AG, and the security personnel. But so taking that further, it's not just to discuss, but recognizing that power in terms of internal security and operational policing sits with Government House, but you have an arrangement whereby you talk about issues. But what we're saying is that what you have as Governor's Council, as opposed to just talking about, recognizing that in terms of hierarchy of authority, since we are a dependent territory, that we don't have that authority. At the same time, the fact that I get along with you doesn't matter. Can we have an arrangement so whereby it's a little more clearly defined? All these things, in terms of in these 10 or so pages, we've put in the hopper. And we did it as a representative in terms of from Bermuda, as opposed to from the overseas territories en masse. You do that because each of us has a different type of constitutional arrangement. For instance, you know, in Turks and Caicos right now, they're seeking to prepare for elections, but right now they really have the UK rule in that island at that present. So you can compare. It isn't like a one-size-fits-all with all the different overseas territories. We all have different, I suppose, idiosyncrasies, and we also are at different stages of development. So to just put an en masse paper in wouldn't make sense. And that's why also, in terms of the letters that went out from us to the opposition leader, to the union leaders, it was to solicit their views, and we also gave them, obviously, because sometimes people wouldn't want to necessarily funnel it through government. They can go directly to the overseas territory FCO, and they may or may not have submitted. I don't know, but certainly that offer was made, and they indicated that they were appreciative of that offer. But it's letting them know that this is something where the white paper, you'll recall when we became the government, there was Partnership for Progress. Well, this is trying to take it to the next level. And at the same time, you also heard when the minister was here that this doesn't preclude other arrangements, but it is that while we're in this relationship, let's see if we can make it work. And let's see what you would like to see happen, and let's have a crucial conversation. They're not saying they're going to agree with everything. I suspect some they may take a different view, but at least you don't, when people ask you for input, at least you have a responsibility to let them know where you see some of the signposts are. So that's really the context for the white paper. It's also the context, I suppose, for the discussions and any follow-up that you may have, because it does cover a wide array of things, and clearly, it's a lot of meat in it, and it just gave you an opportunity from a follow-up. If there were particular queries that you wish to raise, I can try and answer them in that context.